welcome to the Dr. Broadway Podcast, the musical theater history podcast where a couple of doctors sit around and talk about Broadway. I'm your co-host, Dr. Kristin Stultz Pressley, joined as always by Dr. Tracey Brent-Chessum. Tracey, this may or may not be the final episode of the seminar series, which we'll talk about more later. But for now, tell us, what is the topic of the hour today?
Well, we're so excited because today we have David Armstrong, the writer of Broadway Nation and the popular podcaster of the podcast of the same name, here to be with us. Welcome, David.
Thank you so much. I'm thrilled to be possibly the finale of your seminar series.
I say possibly because I got an email yesterday from a publicist that I was like, maybe. You probably got the same email, so you may be thinking the same, maybe, so time will tell. But David, I am so excited to have you here to talk about your book. The book, as Tracey mentioned, is Broadway Nation, and the subtitle is How Immigrants, Jewish, Queer, and Black Artists Invented the Broadway Musical. So before we get into that, David, though, I want to talk a little bit more, give us a little bit more of your background. I know that prior to writing this book, you have 40 years of experience in the theater industry, perhaps most notably as the producing artistic director and executive producer at the Fifth Avenue Theater in Seattle, Washington. So tell us about that and how you were a part of sending shows like Hairspray and Memphis to Broadway.
Sure. I am new to the academic world, unlike the two of you. I started very young as a director and choreographer working in regional theaters all across the country. I was very lucky to establish a career doing that through some, contacts that I had and people who believed in me before they had any right to believe in me, which I'm very grateful for. So it's been more than 40 years that I have been working in the professional theater as first a choreographer, then a director, then a producer, artistic director, writer, on and on. I've worn many hats during that time. And the highlight of that was absolutely the 18 years I was at the Fifth Avenue Theater in Seattle, where I still am at the moment. And there it was, such an honor to be the producing artistic director, executive director eventually of one of the largest producing companies in America, which was, just a dream. If you told me when I was 18 years old and starting out in this business that that's what was going to happen, that would have been, I don't know that I could have imagined that. And then when I spent 20 years prior to that in New York as a freelance, theater maker. And during that time, I made some contacts that then paid off when I went to Seattle, because there's sort of a 6-month period between when I got the job at the Fifth Avenue and when I went to Seattle to take the job. And during that time, every Broadway producer that I had any contact with, if I ran into them or, I would say, I'm going to Seattle, Fifth Avenue Theater. I think this would be a great place to try out shows, to be another La Jolla, another theaters that were doing that kind of thing at the time. The old
great theater far away from New York.
Exactly.
Far away.
Which really meant something at that time.
Yes.
Yeah.
It was a giant advantage that we had, that Michael Riedel would not get on the airplane to come to Seattle to see things.
That has come up before on this podcast. So
it has.
And of course, this is pre-internet and all of that kind of stuff. When this is 2000, when I'm going there to take the job. And so, to my great pleasure, I guess I'll say, but just gratification, is that about 6 months after I came to Seattle, I got a phone call from one of those Broadway producers that I had interacted with, and said, "We have this show called Hairspray. Would you be interested in? We'd be interested in talking to you about doing the pre-Broadway engagement in Seattle." And that led to a great relationship with those producers, led by Margot Lyon, who's one of the great ladies of the theater. So I miss her so much, but we did 3 shows with Margot. And part of what made that happen is that after Hairspray, and of course, the the chance that you would start out with this kind of endeavor and have it turn into Hairspray
Right.
was, so just a stroke of luck that you could never replicate. And in fact, it was, I guess Aladdin has had even more, or will have even more success than Hairspray, but I feel like Hairspray was you can't repeat that of what happened with Hairspray.
Yeah. Well, let me ask you this before you go on. When you first were approached about the idea for Hairspray, I mean, I don't imagine that you foresaw what it became, obviously, but did you foresee, I could see this being a pretty significant hit? I mean, what was your first thought when you got that approach with that idea?
I write a little bit about this in the book. It was a very unlikely thing to become a hit. If you really looked at it, I mean, number one, it was based on a movie by John Waters, whose entire oeuvre was to, insult middle-class values, basically.
A little bit against the grain, for sure.
Totally. And nobody involved with it had ever written a Broadway show before, other than Tom Meehan, who was just sort of brought in right at the end there to help them along. So it didn't have a track record, and none of the people involved in it, so many of them became stars afterwards. The only person of note was Harvey Fierstein, and even he wasn't really that well known at that point outside of New York City. So I actually had to do a lot of talking to my board and a lot of reassuring and a lot of saying, we need to do this, and it may not pay off. There's no guarantee. And even the producers, of course, were not sure. No one can ever be sure that anything's going to become successful. And so it was a giant risk, and not something that you could say, well, this is, has a track record to show that it will become, a slam dunk by any means.
Well, I mean, if you look at it, like, there really hadn't been a huge film to Broadway hit at that point. Remember, we talked about the film to Broadway hits, the film to Broadway, they weren't hits. Like, people were throwing them at the wall in the 90s, and they were going up and closing going up and closing. Yeah. So, like, this probably was a very heavy lift. So.
Yeah, and Hairspray was not a very well-known film. So it wasn't even like something you think, well, just the name will sell it.
Yeah,
it was basically an unknown quantity to the largest part of the audience. So then that it turned out. I mean, from the first preview, one of the most thrilling. Again, I write about that in the book. Nights of My Life was the first preview of Hairspray in Seattle. No one had ever seen any of this show before. And it's hard to put yourself back in that place. But I had the opportunity to be there and sit in this audience where they screamed after the opening number. And then they screamed after every number that came. And the third night, the third preview, we had 250 members of the Seattle Men's Chorus in the audience.
Oh my gosh.
That's awesome.
And at the end of that performance, it seems like a scene from a bad movie. The audience would not leave the theater. They just kept cheering and applauding. The cast took their bows, went away in the dressing rooms at the Fifth Avenue Theater upstairs. So they're a long way. And they would not leave until Harvey came back in his robe and his wig cap onto the stage to take another bow. It was a good 5 minutes that they awesome. It was, and they're telling Harvey, go back. He said, he didn't believe they would still be applauding by the time he got down there. Yeah, it was a thrilling, amazing night.
Well, awesome. I'm sorry to interrupt you. So post Hairspray, continue telling us about the Fifth Avenue Theater.
So we had the opportunity then, of course, that opened a lot of doors. Margot, in fact, went back to New York and told everyone, all her colleagues, that she was never going to do another pre-Broadway show except at the Fifth Avenue Theater, which was an amazing thing to be told by other people. Yeah. And then we ended up doing, a series of shows that would go to Broadway. Some of them were very successful. Some of them were less successful, or, it did not run very long. I'm very proud, actually, of some of the shows that have, like even The Wedding Singer, which was not a giant success, but has found its place in the canon. It is produced all the time now. Yep. So it's the impact that we were able to have. I really am just incredibly proud of.
Well, you should be. And we likely in a future season will be talking specifically about Hairspray. And so you're very likely to get a call again to say, David, would you come back and tell us more?
I love to talk about Hairspray.
So
Absolutely.
stay tuned. But at some point while you're out there in Seattle working at the Fifth Avenue Theater, you get a call from the University of Washington. Is that correct? And you're
Right.
asked to teach a class. So tell us about that, how that happened, and what led to the writing of Broadway Nation.
Sure. When I stepped down from my position in 2018, very shortly afterwards, the University of Washington School of Drama contacted me and of course, we had worked with them on various capacities over the years. We had a lot of, the Fifth Avenue was another thing I'm immensely proud of. There is just the outreach to the theater community in general, to all the other professional theaters, to the educational programs. We had all kinds of programs and interaction with that over the years. So they contacted me to see if I would be interested in teaching a lecture course on the history of the Broadway musical. The idea being sort of a large lecture course as those kinds of things go. And of course, I was interested in that. I had always been interested in history. I was one of those directors who would, do tons of research on any show I was doing, or producing, and loved, and then had done a series of adult educational programs at the Fifth, where sort of, lecture demonstration kinds of things. Before each production, we would do a large event and get 1,000 people to show up for them, which was amazing, and talk about the history of the show and have performances, sort of of mini versions of what I ended up doing with my podcast later, and the book. It all sort of added up. But the main thing I had to figure out then was, what if I was going to teach the history of the Broadway musical? How was I going to teach it? How was I going to talk about it? There are a lot of ways to approach it. It's a big subject, as you know. It's 125 plus, depending where you want to start, years of history. And always in my mind, I had thought that this is based on this very unique set of circumstances and the set of what made what the genesis of the Broadway musical comes out and out of the number one, out of immigration of the period that it happens in, out of limitations of opportunity in the period that it happens in, which then the opportunity where there was opportunity was in the Broadway musical. So the idea that immigrant Jewish, queer, and Black artists invented the Broadway musical came to me early on, and I pitched that as the idea to the School of Drama about, here's the approach I want to take on this. And then I had to start developing and doing the research to do it. And I'm sure you guys find this all the time, is you think you know a lot about something, and then you start doing the research and you realize, oh, there's a whole lot here I had no idea about.
Yes, that's exactly. And you're kind of embarrassed by the fact, like, I've been doing this for so long. How am I still learning?
Embarrassed and excited about it too, because you discover this whole little world of something that you didn't know. You go down a rabbit hole and it's like, oh wow, who knew this? Why don't I know this? And that became part of the reason for the course, and especially the book, is the why don't I, if I don't know this, then I know that there's most other people do not know this, even if they're immersed in the history of the Broadway musical.
So what I find so interesting is the fact that, just for everybody listening at home, the history of musical theater was not something that was taught widely in any way, shape, or form for years and years and years. And it's, the first time I got to teach the history of musical theater was like 2012. Yeah. So like, this is a very recent thing. And why don't I know any of this? That there's a reason for that. There weren't lots of textbooks. There weren't lots of books on the Broadway kind of musical other than coffee table books. And those were very, very limited. So having to jump
photos.
So
the only information would be the caption. You would get 3 sentences in the caption under the photo. Yeah.
And so we'd get, we'd get a little bit. We got a little bit of the overview, but it wasn't something that was given scholarly treatment. So it wasn't really being taught in the universities. So it was really nice to hear David say, it's like, I had been researching these musicals individually, and now I had to put it together as a theme all the way across. And I will say, David has the first distinction of being somebody that I was reading and I'm like, yay! He doesn't think The Black Crook is a musical either. Thank God. I love this man.
I thought of you, Tracey, when I read that part.
I was like reading and I'm like, I love him already.
Yes.
As somebody who has made her entire career out of teaching the history of musical theater, you don't find that in history books. You find kind of the repetition of what we have found before. And so, David, I applaud you. What I'll tell you about this book, that as I've been getting through it, it's just, he's not afraid to say, hey, I don't think we got this quite right. Yes. This is what is out there, and that is not what the archive is actually telling us. This is something that, has been passed down, and we need to kind of recraft this. So David, I have so enjoyed this. But this, putting it together as a class, as you know, this is what it reads like too. And you're going to learn so much in it. So.
Well, I will say, to your point, Tracey, about how there really wasn't, in terms of scholarly work on musical theater, it didn't exist for really until the last 20 years. To any great extent. There were people who were writing, but the musical theater did not certainly get the attention then that it does now. And so what is lacking is a musical theater textbook. If you're going to teach a musical theater history course, there is no, Oscar Brockett's History of Theater, which would be analogous, there's no analogous textbook to that. And so when I picked this up and started going through it, I was like, if I were teaching a history of musical theater class, this would be my textbook.
Oh, yeah.
Because it covers it all from stem to stern, including starting with, what does it mean to be a Broadway theater? What is the geography of a Broadway theater?
What is Broadway?
Yes. Yeah. Yes. Things that we as practitioners or students of theater for decades now take for granted. A kid who just walks into a class probably doesn't know, even if they do think they're fans of theater, right? So that's one thing that I think is such a great success of this book. I will tell you, we have the same publisher, Methuen Drama, and I was one, before I ever knew you, David, who read your book proposal. I was one of the silent readers. Surprise!
It doesn't surprise me, but it's always great to hear when you meet somebody who, and I've done that for other people as well.
Yeah. Well, I will tell you, my feedback was, this is so incredibly necessary. And I tell you what, you had it all laid out perfectly. You knew exactly, obviously it was all perfectly laid out. And my only criticism was, I don't know how he can do this in one book. It is so broad. But David, you did it in one book. So you proved me wrong. Well done.
And incredibly well.
How did you get your arms around 125 years worth of history with a million different moving parts?
Well, luckily, I got to do it 3 times. So I had the course, which came first, and I had to figure out how to boil this down into, 10 weeks of lectures twice a week for 2.5 hours. So 20 lectures. So that was the first, effort. And of course, then I taught it for several years. So I was able to refine that. As you know, with any course, you learn so much. It's like a pre-Broadway tryout. You learn what works, what doesn't work, what you want to change, what the students responded to, what they didn't respond to. And then as we went into the pandemic, I knew I was going to have to teach the course remotely. And I already had in this idea, my idea that I was going to, these lectures, if I could make sort of general audience friendly versions of them, I might turn some of that into podcast. So I was already sort of starting on that. And then the pandemic was coming. I thought, well, if I sort of put the gas on that and get those ready, I can use those when we have to teach remotely.
Smart.
And I've ended up using those, forever, ever since then, because they're just so effective. And I sort of do slightly different versions for the students, but basically the versions of the podcast. So that was sort of phase 2 of now I have to encompass this and write about it and talk about it and explain it for a general audience in a series of 40-minute podcasts or so.
Right.
So that was another opportunity to edit and figure out the structure for it.
Yeah.
And go ahead.
It's funny how the pandemic actually gave us just, every once in a while we got a gift. I did something similar in the fact that like we ended up taping, all of my lectures via Zoom, and we've been able to take and extract and edit and use that material. Every once in a while I have to go back now and be like, this was done 6 years ago. If I'm talking about current events there, don't freak out. You have not missed something. But like, what great foresight on your part. This is great stuff.
Yeah, it was just dumb luck mostly, but it seemed like an opportunity at the time. And then bringing it back to Method and Drama, because I had started the podcast and the podcast started being very successful after I sort of did the first season of the podcast, which was basically the chronological history of the Broadway musical. Then I thought, well, what am I going to do now? I've gotten up to the present day. And so I started, but I knew there were so many books coming out about individual aspects of the Broadway musical.
Yeah.
So I started reaching out to those authors and having them on the podcast as guests. And that eventually led me to Dom O'Hanlon at Method and Drama, because I had interviewed several of his authors. So he got to know who I was. And then he approached me about would I be interested in writing a book about the same subject with the same approach, how immigrant Jewish, queer, and Black artists invented the Broadway musical. And of course, that was the best case scenario for this, was to be asked to do it. I thought about publishing, all those things, and his idea, just speaking to what you said before, Kristin, is he thought there's a place in the market for a new textbook.
Yeah.
Yes.
And it actually is being marketed by Method and Drama as a textbook.
Yeah,
so they're doing that part of it. Well, that's in the process. I hear that it's being looked at and being very well received. We haven't gotten yet to the point of people committing to adopt it yet, or at least that I know about yet.
Yeah, well, it should be, but go ahead, I'm sorry.
I was going to say that exactly, he thought there's just, and it had been about 10 years since Larry Stempel's book, which is a very, very good book, Showtime.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I, leaned on that book quite a bit. But there was anytime, even with my book, you finish your book, as you know, and you're doing a full history of the Broadway musical. It's out of date by 9 months by the time it comes out. Yeah. So he felt that was an opportunity there.
So one of the things that's just very, very different between your books and the textbooks that have come before. So it's like Showtime, Larry Stempel, yes. Right before that was Sheldon Patinkin in No Legs, No Jokes, No Chance. All of them are giving kind of chronological history. And I'm going to keep talking about this. What I really like about the way you've kind of structured this is the fact that you are starting to highlight the things that we've traditionally left out. I think my favorite part of the book, and another place where I cheered, was just the fact that like chapter 2 is called Forgotten Forefathers, and really kind of brings the Black artists into kind of the forefront of, I've always taught in my musical theater class that, Shuffle Along is a pretty integrated musical. I don't know what I don't know why it got left out of the timeline, but
and it's called a review very often in history books. It's like it was a book musical.
Yeah, and it's so funny because it just was not in a lot of these textbooks, and so it's been really nice to kind of get to the point in this subject area that I love, where we're really starting to go back and be like, okay, so let's rewrite this narrative a little bit. So thank you for doing that. Thrilled.
And that you asked me about what I didn't know before, what I discovered, and that was that when I felt really dumb, I'll say it was when discovering that first 10 years from 1896, or I think it's 96 to 1910, basically, of that series of a dozen or more Black musicals produced, directed, starring Black artists on Broadway. Now, Broadway was mostly a touring business in those days. So shows would play a short time on Broadway and then tour across the country, but they'd play for 2 years sometimes. Shows I never heard of and artists I knew very little about. I knew Williams and Walker, but I thought of them as vaudeville stars. So we didn't really think of them, at least I was not aware of their impact on Broadway in book musicals, at the same simultaneously with George M. Cohan is what I find so interesting about it. Is, I knew everything about George M. Cohan, but I didn't know that across the street were these Black musicals doing basically the same thing and being influenced by each other.
Yeah. And that's, Tracey and I have a rule on this podcast. We never say anything is the first. Yeah. Because as sure as we claim something was the very first, we'll come across something that was before it and then something that was before that. So we have learned in our years of doing this, of studying history and researching, that you never claim the first, because it can always
it's tricky territory. Yeah, I mean, I try to make sure in my book I say this is the first we know of, or this is the first that we can that has been discovered at this moment or thought about it. Yeah.
Well, and we talked about that on some of the early episodes of our podcast too, is just the fact that it's like there was only so much available. So for somebody to write the very first book on the history of musical theater, we knew there was going to be gaps there, and then we're starting to add in. But unfortunately, what's kind of happened was it was like we started to add in as we started moving through, and we weren't taking out sometimes some of the stuff that where we had just filled in the gaps. And like the idea, again, we'll go back to the idea that like the Black Crook is the first musical. Well, this is, yes, a really important commercial performance, and there's, yes, something that we need to do here. But essentially what happened there is we had somebody who was looking back and going, where's the first musical? And looking at the New York Times and looking at, the rest of the newspapers and just finding tons about this and then nothing before it and going, this must be it. Right? So.
Totally. And it's a giant event in the history of show business. There's no doubt about that. Right. But to call it a musical. And I was always looking at what has impact on the form and the future of the musical. And that, except from the girly show aspect, and you can't even just, there are other people, I think, with like Lydia Thompson, who I talked about in the book, who have equal impact or more impact in that regard, and are actually probably more important, but is in the same kind of world as that. So,
something that I do want to point out, though, is that we've talked about this and how it would be such an outstanding textbook for a musical theater history course, and I'm so glad to hear it's being marketed that way. It absolutely should be. But I don't want our listeners to misunderstand that this is some sort of academic, I can't understand it because it's all talking in theories and circular reasoning.
Oh, no,
This is a deeply accessible, enjoyable read. That's something that I've appreciated working with Beth and Drama, is the understanding that, yes, we need to treat this, with an academic rigor, but at the same time, the bulk of musical theater fans are not going to want to read academic writing, right? So we need to make it accessible, and you really capture that tone very successfully in this book.
Well, I really appreciate hearing that. I thank you so much, because that was one of my goals. Is I don't come from the academic world. I have an actual sort of aversion to academics. I read everybody's book basically, but I'm always wondering, why can't we use a regular word? Why do we have to use these other words? And even some like diegetic, I have a whole section in my book about why I don't think that's a good word to use, because it's confusing. And in fact, I used it the first 2 years I taught my course, and I would just have to explain it and explain it and explain it to the students. And the minute I started using acknowledged and unacknowledged, I never had to explain it again. They totally got it the first time through. I understand what you're talking about.
Yeah.
And so, yes, the book is not filled with a lot of jargon in any way. I try to make it the kind of book I most like to read, which is just feels like somebody is explaining it to you in very accessible language, but it's completely scholarly in its content and in its documentation.
Yes,
100%.
The documentation is very well done, very well done. And as one of those weird, academics that is writing that academic-y book with the big jargon because I have to.
Well, that's what they want you to do. I understand that. I've had an advantage to not having been in that world. Yeah.
Well, I know, but that's why I kind of love this so much, is because I've never used a textbook for musical theater history, not once, because I couldn't find anything that I liked. And because so many of the works about musical theater that I was grabbing, that I was like, okay, this will really, really work. This, has good scholarship and everything, was just so over their head. So I can assign those to the graduate students. I can assign it to the PhD students. I could not assign it to the undergrads, but this I can assign because they are going to understand every single word in it. And they're not going to go, ugh, another big article. Like it's approachable, but it has all of the right information in it, and it's so well researched. And anybody can come to it and grab something from it. So bravo to you.
Yeah,
thank you. That is wonderful to hear.
Yes, and it's sincere. I mean, in fact,
I am rarely this effusive.
I know
you don't know me.
And said,
I did. I was texting. I love this man. Oh my gosh. Because I was like, you don't know what you're going to get. And then I was like, I have fallen in love with my new textbook. Yay!
It's so good. It's really good. Well, it's just exciting to see it because I know for how many years I looked for something like it. And there's just nothing comparable that's as exhaustive, as well researched, that takes the same approach, like Tracey pointed out. Others kind of take a chronological approach, but yours is a broad. It's a different structure that you take, and it's really, really successful. I wonder, as you did all of this research, I wonder what was something that was the most surprising that you found.
I mean, the number one was those Black shows.
Yeah.
The Red Moon is a show that fascinates me. That whole series of shows from that early period. But then equally to we Shuffle Along was a show that we knew about, at least. Of course, there was a recent the Broadway sort of not revival of it, but the show about it.
Yes.
That I did see. But then to discover that there were 20 more shows after that, following it in the decade following Shuffle Along, and all by Black artists, many of the same artists who worked on Shuffle Along. It had this whole spin-off with shows I had barely heard of and many I'd never heard of.
Yeah.
And so that I thought, and now part of this became, and I started to figure out, well, why don't we know about this? And some of it is because a lot of those artists died very young and they didn't have shows. And the shows, most of the shows from what I call the Silver Age have not, been revived for the most part, and certainly not into the 21st century. So, but part of it, I think, is just they didn't have, and some of them had hit songs that would last, like the Charleston, one of the biggest hit songs of all time. But most people don't know it came from a Broadway musical, and that it was a hit Broadway musical, and it was, choreographed by a woman we talked about first, but a woman who at least we can credit as the first acknowledged Black choreographer, actually the second acknowledged Black choreographer of a Broadway musical. There are just so many, it's like discoveries within discoveries along the way that fascinated me. And in terms of women too, we're in Women's History Month, and women are not in the title per se because they're included in all those categories. We actually had women in the title at one point: immigrant, Jewish, queer, Black, and women, female artists or women artists. We had it different ways. We thought, well, they're Black female, they're already there. So it felt weird to call out women in the title, but it was one of my goals in this book was to highlight this incredible group of women who have been involved in the musical theater from the very beginning, from day one,
right. That's right.
which I think is something I wasn't as fully aware of, and I think most people don't know.
No, David.
There are women like Dorothy Donnelly, who directed, who was a director, writer, actress, lyricist, book writer for dozens of shows starting at the in the 1920s, and big hit shows.
Yes, that was something that this is kind of a perfect example of how musical theater scholarship has progressed just since I was in graduate school 25 years ago.
It cannot be 25 years ago.
When I started my master's in 2003, so what is
that?
Okay. 23?
All right.
23 years ago.
I'll give you that.
Yeah. We're knocking on heaven's door.
Oh, gosh.
But when I started my research on Dorothy Fields, which was going to be my master's thesis, that was the thinking was, oh, she's the first woman lyricist, right? That's what we knew, was she's the first woman lyricist. Well, it didn't take 10 minutes before I was like, wait a minute. She's not the first woman lyricist. She's the most prolific of that era.
And the one who lasted the longest.
That's right.
So that's why we know about her.
That's right.
Yeah.
But when particularly I wrote a biography of her in 2021, and as I was digging into that, I was finding that this was in the conclusion of my book, in fact. Percentage-wise, there were more women working on Broadway in the 1920s than in the 2010s.
Absolutely.
And I was going through, the historic record, and I'm finding all these women whose names keep coming up and up and up and up. And so I didn't know what to do with them because my biography was about Dorothy Fields, and I didn't want to, lose my focus, but I wanted to bring them up. And so in the conclusion, I mentioned as many of those names of those women as I could. And I just say, something's wrong, that if there were more women working in the 1920s than there are now, something's got to give, right? But
Absolutely.
I think that's what's so exciting, that there's more people like Tracey and I, like yourself, who are looking back through the historic record, and we're mining for the truth of history, at least as we can find it with the tools that we now have that maybe people in earlier years didn't have. And we're able to amplify some of these voices that have really been lost to history until now.
Absolutely. And people say, well, women were totally shut out of the Broadway musical. And my point is, no, they weren't. They were right there. Now, that obviously, like any other endeavor in the 20th century, women had less opportunity than men did.
Yeah.
But to say that they didn't have any opportunity, that they weren't making a giant impact, is completely wrong.
Yeah.
I'm not gonna be exact on these stats because I can't recall them exactly, but these are pretty close. It was a 30% of the musicals that opened probably in the decade of 1920 to 1930. That's probably what I was looking at. 30% of those shows had a woman as a creator. So a woman director, a woman librettist, a woman composer, a woman lyricist, a woman, I think I also included maybe music director. And in the 2010s, it was like 21%. So
I totally believe that. Yeah. And I have a little section in the book, I think I call it Daughters of Dorothy, which is basically how she inspired this wave, or seemingly inspired, who knows, but there was this wave of women working on Broadway in the 20s and the 30s, as you said. I mean, the Depression, makes it so much harder to get a Broadway musical on that it's really bad news for Black artists, for women, for anybody to make that happen. I just want to add one thing, because it ties into what you just said, is Cassine Gaines, who wrote that terrific book, When Broadway Was Black.
Broadway Was Black.
He says,
I love that book.
I think maybe I quote him in the book too, that there were more Black artists on Broadway in 1925 than there are today.
Yes. I picked that book up.
Oh, yes.
In New York for Broadway Con in 2025. I saw you were just at Broadway Con yourself this year, and I picked that up at the Museum of Broadway, and it was fascinating, but it was all new information to me, I knew a little bit about Shuffle Along. I mean, I knew more probably than the average theater goer.
Of course.
And I should, right? I should. That's my job. But man, I had no idea. And he did such a beautiful job in that book. And again, if you missed it, it's called When Broadway Was Black. And it's by Cassine Gaines. And I highly recommend it as well. It is fantastic. But you're right. He comes to the same conclusion that I did, that wait a minute, women were working, we've just forgotten them.
Yeah. Totally. And we kind of need people like Kristin, who's obsessed with newspapers, to kind of go back and find all of those names, because like when I come to research, a lot of it is archival. And so if I find a name and I can find, usually I'm going through archive boxes and, things like that. And what's interesting about especially the early period of musical theater history is just that so many of these shows are being kind of remade into something else to go to the next stop. And so there's not ever really a definitive version of it. And because that happens, we don't have like a copy of something that somebody's put in an archive somewhere. Right. And even when we do have it, they haven't been open for years. I went to go read all of the scripts by, or the lyrics and libretto by Harry B. Smith, who worked for lots of composers, one of which is John Philip Sousa. And his shows are like head and tails so much more an integrated book musical than I'd had seen for the 20 years after that. But it had been stuck in a box at the City Archives of New York for something like, they said, nobody's opened this in, I think they said 65 years when I got there. Wow. And that's the reality of it, is we have not mined this. And so this is...
We have scratched the surface.
This is really fun.
Yeah, and I feel that same way. There's so much now that people I could identify in the book, like Hassard Short is one of these amazing people, this director, this very crucial director, stager, choreographer in the history of the Broadway musical, who we almost never... He's a name you find in most books, but there's no detail about him or any emphasis on the impact that he had on. And here's this great, queer artist who basically as living as out as you could possibly be in that period, and has this long career from the 20s into the 50s. Yeah. And he's somebody now who I'd love to see a whole book about. Yeah. Mm-hmm. I feel like, well, I've just scratched the surface, as you just said, of this person who I would like to read about. I don't know how broadly, whether there's what kind of market there is for a book about Hassard Short, but he's a fascinating figure, and an important one that I think has just been sidelined. Again, he was a gay man. He didn't really have any heirs. There's this, there's reasons people got lost in the shuffle along the way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that leads me to my next question. You've covered the breadth of Broadway history. I wonder, is there a next project? Is there something that, like, I dug this guy up and now I'm going to run with that? Or for me, whenever I find names that I don't know or that I'm fascinated by, I have a list of people I want to write about. Carol Churchill, the producer, Rachel Crothers, the playwright. I mean, it just goes on and on. I'm going to write about them someday, and I will never. It's physically impossible for me to get to all of them, but I do keep a list. I wonder, for you, was there one piece of this enormous amount of research that you did that you're like, I want to run with that next?
Yes, there are a lot, but probably the one that's getting the most traction for me at the moment is, and I did a couple of podcasts about this, is the idea that Broadway, for most of its period, from the 20s through into the 50s, really into the 60s, was not just the shows that were on Broadway, was not the legitimate theaters. And in fact, all the songs about Broadway, the lullaby of Broadway, are not talking about the shows at all. They're talking about the nightclubs. They're talking about this world of 200 to 300 nightclub speakeasies that were happening, that really defined what Broadway was for the most part in the public's imagination. So I've started doing research into that. I'm calling it the other Broadway at the moment.
Love it.
I love that. That came up when I was writing about Dorothy, because one of her big hits, which was kind of a stepping stone for her from the Cotton Club to Broadway, was Lou Leslie's International Review in 1928, and I can't remember the name of the nightclub. It was a French word, but it was exactly what you're describing. It was one of those nightclubs where they had floor shows and they had to have songwriters for them. Another that she wrote for was at the New Amsterdam, Ziegfeld's Midnight Frolic, which she also wrote for. I mean, that is so, we don't have anything like that now. Or how people would leave a Broadway show and go uptown to the Cotton Club.
Right.
And there's painfully little that's been done with the Cotton Club, which is, just a treasure trove for someone to dig through.
But what's interesting is we know more about the Cotton Club than we do about the hundreds of nightclubs that were right across the street from the Broadway theaters, where so many people. I have trouble imagining this world where shows didn't start till 8:30.
Yeah.
And then they didn't end till 11 o'clock, obviously, or till after 11, after the 11 o'clock spot. And then people went out to a nightclub. And it's like, when did they sleep?
They must have been much younger than I am.
And there are these big Broadway stars who emerge from these nightclubs who do relatively few Broadway shows, like Jimmy Durante and Sophie Tucker, but are famous Broadway stars from appearing in the nightclubs.
Yes. Well, I will tell you.
And then become
Fields,
movie stars.
That is certainly a big part of Dorothy Fields' biography.
Yeah, totally.
Is writing floor shows first for the Cotton Club, and then, like I said, this French club, like at 57th Street or something like that. I can't remember. And then the Flo Ziegfeld's Midnight Frolic atop the New Amsterdam Theater. So you're right. That I hope you do run with that, because that's something that has piqued my interest, but not enough to run with it. So you run, and I can't wait to read it.
We'll see. Not on
or listen to your podcast episodes about it, for sure.
I mean, definitely. I have two, I think maybe three that I started this, and I start back at the end of the 19th century with this idea. Sort of, how did this even world of nightclub entertainment emerge? But it is something I'm fascinated by. So we'll see. David, see where it goes.
That's a great question for you. How do you get this interest, you do all this research, and you are like, oh, I want to look more at these nightclubs. Where do you go? What's your resource? What's your process for research?
A number of fronts.
Yeah.
With that project, I did a lot of reading of biographies or of the people like Jimmy Durante, like those people who were involved in this, because they're actually more likely to talk about that than you will find in any history book about it. You find anyone say, this is what I did, this is where I was. Yes. So if you're reading a biography of Sophie Tucker, you're going to find out that where she established herself, where she worked. So then that gives you the names and the even the world you're trying to discover. And then, of course, a lot of I'll do through newspapers, newspapers.com, is then you can start looking into these specific clubs, which came and went a lot.
Yes, they did.
So they're hard to tie down, but they were reported on. And so it basically sort of goes from there. I think my initial point has been, there you'll find certain books. There's a book about the rooftop theaters, which were basically nightclubs of the time, which there was a series of those during that period. Sorry about that.
You're good. No, I asked that because, one of the things that Tracey and I, one of the reasons why we do this podcast, I'm sure one of the reasons why you do yours, is because we want to equip people, right? So that you find something that you're interested in and you can't find a book about it. Where do you go to learn more? Well, it's probably not going to be in a textbook necessarily. So dig into other biographies. I tell you, a great resource that I discovered when I was writing for Pulitzer Prize winning musicals was archive.org, because there's so many out of print biographies of those great, Abe Burrows and Adler and all those guys that had these autobiographies that I couldn't go buy at Barnes & Noble if I wanted to, but I can go on archive.org and they're almost all there, and I can read them for free for an hour at a time. And it's just a treasure trove, as is newspapers.com, which is my favorite resource.
Well, and you can see behind me, I'm a big believer. I go on Amazon and order these old out of print books for $1.95. Yeah, you can get them at really, at incredible prices.
Mm-hmm.
Used, out of print books like, some of the ones I was just talking about. Yeah. So, yeah.
And you get anecdotes from those books that did not, haven't made the historic record. And so
Absolutely.
You're able to pull those back out, and it's so fulfilling to be able to do that as a historian. And, I think that brings me to another question, something that I worry about as a historian, and I would love to hear your feedback on this. As we move away from the newspaper model, I mean, you and I have both talked about how we rely heavily on that, and how I could look at a date in, let's take Dorothy Fields, 1927, end of 1927, beginning of 1928, when she's writing for the Cotton Club and then this French named club at 57th Street or wherever. And I can see 6 to 7 different newspapers in New York writing reviews of the floor show.
Mm-hmm.
We don't have that anymore.
It's all on social media.
It's all on social media, which isn't archived, right?
Yes, and how do we archive the social media? Because that's what we're going to be using.
The information that we are not archiving in print.
I am just so happy I'm not going to be writing a book 20 years.
That's why I write about the golden age.
Because it's going to be impossible to talk about the shows of today.
I agree.
In the future, because obviously there will be, who knows? It's hard to understand. Yes. And obviously these links to all these things will exist in time, but it's just, and then the letters is the other thing.
Right.
Emails. Yes. Yeah.
How much now is a text that is gone with the wind? It's a vapor.
But so much of what we can find about the past came from people writing letters to each other.
You can see that giant tome of Oscar Hammerstein's letters right there. I've got Frank
Exactly.
Lesser's over there.
Yeah, back there. Yeah.
Absolutely.
And I was able to draw on all of that for this book, or so much of that for this book. All those newspapers, collections of letters, biographies, autobiographies, all that kind of stuff was a treasure trove of information, especially if the first thing I do when I pick up any book, if I'm at a used books or something, is I go to the index and see who are they talking about.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
What are they saying about Hassard Short, or people who you find talked about in these books, but you never would have noticed them if you weren't looking for them.
Yes, absolutely. Well, David, this has been fascinating, not only to talk about your book, but to talk about your process, to talk about your career, to talk about the fact that you have the same fear that I do for the future of archiving. I know Tracey shares that fear, but I wonder if, as we wrap things up, do you have any last words that you want to share with our audience?
One of the fun, or the most, gratifying aspects of writing this book was that you are empowered to, when you do it, to decide what are we going to call these eras of the musical.
Right.
And that was one of the things you asked me before, what surprised me the most. I was surprised, as I did the research, that almost no historians agree on what the eras of the musical were or what they should be called.
Yeah.
Specifically, almost everybody will talk about the golden age of Broadway, but you ask them to define when that was or whether it actually happened, and you will get so many different answers.
Yeah.
Yes.
And so for me, that was a great puzzle aspect of this, and was to, how am I going to teach it, first of all, and then how am I going to write about it? I have to define it.
Yes.
Even if it's, and I say, this is my opinion. This is not a definitive that I'm saying everybody should do, but it's where I came up with the idea of the 5 main sections of the book: the Genesis period, which is when the musical is born. And again, there's a trap there of when did it actually start? Well, that's impossible to pin down, but you can say when it sort of emerged as a thing. And then what I call the Silver Age,
which I'm totally, I'm stealing that. I think you may have coined something, because mine are totally different, but I went, ooh, that is Good. I like that. I might steal it.
I do too. Go ahead, David.
You are welcome to it, because I do get makes sense. It's to call it the golden age only makes sense if you're only talking about the songs.
Yeah.
Because of course it is the songs from those shows have lived on and are, the center point of the Great American Songbook. But literally one of those shows, there's 300 shows produced in what I call the Silver Age, the 20s and the 30s.
Mm-hmm.
And one of those shows, Anything Goes, is ever produced today.
Yeah.
So you can't call that the golden age of the Broadway musical, as far as I'm concerned.
Mm-mm.
It's something great, it's something amazing, but it's not. And then the difference between that and what I call the golden age, which is basically starts with Oklahoma and goes into the 60s, it goes through the 60s for the most part, is those shows where dozens of them, hundreds of them maybe, are produced on a regular basis, are still with us, are still the centerpiece of the canon of the Broadway musical. That's what makes it the golden age.
Mm-hmm.
And then the modern era was trickier to pin down. It wasn't hard to imagine to pinpoint when it starts. I was always looking at the turning points.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
What were the big shifts in the form of the musical? In hindsight now, I think I might have added another one. I sort of subdivided the modern era into from the 70s to the 21st century, and then the 21st century to today, which I still think is right. But I do feel like we made I could have made that its own separate category, the 21st century, because things did shift, although they went backwards in a lot of ways. So that was.
Well, you can fix that in the second edition, right?
Exactly. Exactly.
Well, David, it has been pure pleasure to have you with us today. Thank you so much for joining us. Tell our listeners where they can find you on social media. I know your YouTube, the podcast is there. So tell them where they can find you.
Sure. The podcast is Broadway Nation. You can find it on any podcast platform as both an audio podcast and now more as an audio podcast. And now I'm also been converting some of that into video. So you can also find it on YouTube, also called Broadway Nation, David Armstrong's Broadway Nation. There, I'm on Instagram, Facebook. If you're interested in this book and the subject, join my Facebook group. I've got 3,000 members in a very active, very fun Broadway Nation Facebook group with a lot of fun, smart people who love to talk about Broadway musicals. So I invite you to find me there as well.
Excellent. Well, David, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Kristin. Thank you, Tracey. It's been a pleasure.
Yeah, we're so delighted. Thank you. So that will do it for this episode of the Dr. Broadway podcast. As I said earlier, this may or may not be the last of our seminar episodes, but regardless, at some point we're going to get back to regularly scheduled programming. Just stay tuned. Until then, you can always connect with us